I wanted to do a video about the March 1981 crimes of Ricky Ray Rector. It's a case that I think is pretty interesting from beginning to end. So Ricky Rector had been in trouble since he was 17 years old, just mostly doing small crimes. That really changed in March 1981 when, at the age of 31, Ricky Ray Rector committed a different type of crime. So according to court records, Ricky Ray Rector was at a restaurant when the crime happened. According to a news article, he was at a dance hall. The news article said that Ricky and some of his friends went to this dance hall where they were refused admission because they couldn't pay the $3 cover charge. Ricky had a .38 caliber weapon on him at the time, and he shot 3 men that were standing outside the dance hall. 2 of those men survived, but one of them, Arthur Criswell, died after being struck in the forehead and throat by the shots. That happened on March 22nd, 1981. Ricky was able to evade arrest for a few days by hiding out at his sister's house. A Conway police officer that had known Ricky since he was a child arranged to arrest Ricky. Ricky was supposed to surrender himself to this officer. So Bob Martin, the officer who was not in uniform at the time, went over to Ricky's sister's home for him to surrender. And instead, Ricky went outside and he shot Bob Martin, and then he turned the gun on himself and shot himself. Bob Martin did not survive, but Ricky did survive. The bullet entered Ricky's frontal lobe, but doctors ended up having to remove 3 full inches of Ricky's frontal lobe, and he had extensive brain damage from his left temple to his right ear. Ricky was tried for the 2 murders that he committed, and he was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death. This was really before it was ruled cruel and unusual punishment to put a mentally impaired person to death. According to Ricky Ray Rector's attorney, Ricky had issues in school before he shot himself, but after the shooting, he was like talking to a 4-year-old child. He could hold a conversation, but he couldn't understand abstract ideas. After his surgery, Ricky had an IQ of just 70. Professionals argued on both sides about Ricky Ray's intelligence, but ultimately, Ricky Ray Rector died by lethal injection on January 24th, 1992. As a part of Ricky Ray Rector's final meal, he asked for steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and a piece of pecan pie. Ricky ate everything but the pie, and when they came to get him to take him to the death chamber, he told the guard that he was saving the pie for later. I did also read that the guard actually did not throw away that piece of pie until after Ricky Ray Rector had died. This is about John Edward Swindler. John Edward Swindler was executed in Arkansas June 18th, 1990. September 17th, 1979, Swindler was released from Leavenworth Federal Prison. He then went on a 7-day crime spree that included murders of 3 people. He robbed a gas station and then shot and paralyzed the employee working inside. His intent was to go to Kansas and get justice, but he misread the signs and ended up in Fort Smith, Arkansas. September 24th, 1979, Swindler was at a gas station on Kelly Highway in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He went inside, he got some gas, he checked his car. There was a police officer that had received a bolo named Randy Bassnett. He saw Swindler's car, he checked the ID, he radioed for backup. After Swindler got back in his car, Bassnett walked over to the car, and John Edward Swindler raised his gun and shot Randy Bassnett, the Fort Smith police officer. Officer Bassnett was able to return fire. He superficially shot Swindler, but Swindler was still able to get away. Unfortunately for Swindler, right across the street from the gas station, there was a Arkansas State Trooper station. Swindler left the gas station and drove east. He got lost in a field of soybeans. It wasn't very long before he did surrender to police.
Unfortunately, Randy Basnett died in the ambulance on the way to Sparks Medical Center. John Swindler was convicted in Sebastian County and sentenced to the death penalty. That sentence was overturned. He had another trial in Scott County, Arkansas, where he was also convicted and sentenced to death row. That sentence was not overturned. On June 15th, 1990, Swindler was moved from death row at Varner Prison to the Cummins unit where the death chamber was. He was executed June 18th, 1990, where he became the first person in Arkansas to be executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty. He also became the last person in Arkansas to be executed using the electric chair. Thomas Leo Springs was convicted in 2005 for the 2005 unaliving of his estranged wife, Christina Springs. This case has stuck with me for a long time now. I remember whenever it happened, it just seemed so unbelievable. Christina and Thomas shared 6 children together. In December 2004, Christina took her children and she went to stay at the Crisis Intervention Center in Fort Smith. There were several reports of Thomas on several different days driving around the neighborhood, around the Crisis Intervention Center. And the police had even came out and told him that he needed to leave the neighborhood. On January 5th, Christina went to file for an order of protection. In her affidavit for order of protection, she cited that she was physically and verbally abused by Thomas on an almost daily basis. She claimed that he had previously kidnapped her, tied her up with duct tape, held a knife to her throat, and threatened to cut her into pieces. And at the end of the affidavit, she said, "Please help me." Christina was granted an order of protection, a temporary one, which protected her and her children. The permanent order of protection was issued on January 18th. It didn't block Thomas from having contact with the children. It only blocked him from having contact with Christina, which is it doesn't really make any sense because they're minors, but that's how it was then. Now, Thomas had a history of violence involving Christina, both directly and indirectly. In 1987, he pled guilty to second-degree battery when he dragged Christina out of a grocery store near where they lived, dragged her back to their apartment, threatened to unalive her, and dunked her head in a bathtub full of water. On that, he got a 2-year prison sentence and a 3-year suspended sentence. 6 months before that, he had pled guilty to attacking a man who tried to break up an argument between the two of them. The man said that he was about to throw Christina off of the balcony. In 1990, he had got a butcher knife and threatened to unalive Christina and their children. Now, on that one, Christina withdrew the complaint, so he wasn't prosecuted for that. In 1995, he was convicted of second-degree battery again, but this time for biting a police officer who responded to a domestic violence incident between the two of them. The morning of January 21st, 2005, one of Christina's older children was dropping 2 younger children off at Sutton Elementary School in Fort Smith. While dropping the children off, she saw Thomas Springs show up at the school to try to get the children. She called police and also called her mother. A police officer did respond to the school. He told Thomas that he needed to leave. He couldn't take the children that day. I'm sorry, you guys. So the police had showed up at the school. They told Thomas to leave, told me he couldn't take the kids. When Thomas was leaving, Christina arrived at the school. He shouted something at her. I couldn't find what was shouted at her. The officer said he couldn't understand him. Christina was understandably worried that Thomas would come back and do something to her. Officer Brad Loki told her that he would follow her he said that he told her he would follow her for a while. Her sister, who was also in the car with her, believed that he would follow them back to the women's shelter. So Officer Brad Loki followed Christina for a short amount of time. Thomas didn't come up while he was following her, so he left. Christina continued on to the women's shelter. Christina was a passenger in the vehicle. The person driving was Christina's sister, Kelly. Also, Kelly's 2-year-old daughter was also in the vehicle. They were driving a white Honda station wagon, and when they came to the intersection of Rogers Avenue and Greenwood Avenue in Fort Smith, they went to turn right, and Thomas ran head on into them with his vehicle, completely disabling their vehicle. He got out of his vehicle. He approached their vehicle, where he used his fist to bust the passenger window where Christina was sitting and started bashing her head on the dash several times before returning to his vehicle to get an 11-inch hunting knife, which he returned to Christina's vehicle with and proceeded to stab her multiple times in front of many, many witnesses. 4 or 5 of those witnesses tried to pull him off of Christina. One of them had to use a crowbar. They were able to subdue him until police arrived. Christina did not make it. In that same year, Thomas was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to the death penalty after the jury deliberated for 3.5 hours. Some of Thomas's children did make statements. They told him how he had affected their lives and how they will forever miss their mother. Thomas appeared to be apologetic. He said he deserved to die. He apologized to his children and told them to take care of each other. Someone asked me to do a death row case, so here is one. This is the case of Jack Green and the murder of Sidney Burnett. It says that Jack Green has been on death row since 1999. That's a little bit misleading. The murder took place in 91, and Jack has been sentenced to death 3 times. Twice it was overturned and remanded to lower courts. Jack Green was part of the group of people that were going to be executed in mass, the 5, in 2017. He was granted a stay based on his mental illness that he has experienced for a long time, since long before the crimes were committed. The crime that Jack Green was sentenced to death row for was the murder of Sidney Burnett, but actually things start before that even. So July 21st of 1991, Jack Green was in North Carolina, where he murdered his brother. Jack Green murdered his brother Tommy. He shot him 5 times. He stole his car, and he abducted Tommy's daughter, who was Jack's niece. Immediately following that crime, Jack ran from North Carolina and ended up in Arkansas. So on July 23rd, Jack was in Knoxville, Arkansas, where he broke into the home of Sidney Burnett. Sidney Burnett was a 69-year-old retired minister. It's said that Sidney had accused Jack of arson a couple of days before this crime. Jack was never charged with an arson, so I don't know about that. But he broke into Sidney Burnett's home. He tied up Sidney's hands, feet, and mouth with filament tape. What Sidney Burnett went through was torturous. He was stabbed twice in the back. He was beaten in the head with a can of hominy. He was cut from mouth to ear. And then he was shot in the chest and in the head using a 25 caliber gun. The 25 caliber weapon was actually the same weapon that was used in the murder of his brother Tommy. So Jack Green was convicted of the murder. He was sentenced to death. It was remanded back to the courts. He was sentenced to death. It was remanded back to the courts, and he was sentenced to death again. He also has a life sentence in North Carolina for the murder of his brother and the abduction of his niece. He is the oldest death row inmate at this time.
Jack Green is 67 years old, and right now there hasn't been any more movement on his execution because of his significant mental health issues and legal questions that were raised due to that.
So last night I posted the video for Jack Green. He is the Arkansas death row inmate. He's the oldest person on Arkansas death row at this time, and he's been on death row since 91. That was only supposed to be one part, but I thought it was worth diving into the North Carolina aspect of the case. So this is part 2. If you're not interested in the North Carolina aspect, then maybe this one isn't for you. So in the last video, I said that Jack Green was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his brother. On July 21st, 1991, Jack Green shot his brother Tommy Green 5 times, killing him on Dragon Strip Road in Mount Pleasant, North Carolina. There was so much publicity surrounding the trial that it was actually moved. It was moved an hour away to High Point, North Carolina. Along with being charged with murder, he was also charged in the kidnapping of his niece, Angela Blankenship, who was Tommy's daughter. Jack Green was sentenced to life in prison, but in 1994, that sentence was overturned by the North Carolina Supreme Court. They overturned convictions for the murder and the kidnapping and ordered a new trial because a judge had refused to allow a psychiatrist to come in and testify on Jack Green's behalf. In 1992, while Jack Green was still serving his life sentence in North Carolina, there was an executive agreement entered between Bill Clinton, who was the governor of Arkansas at the time, and the North Carolina governor, Jim Hunt. So as part of this agreement, Jack Green was transferred from North Carolina Central Prison to Arkansas to stand trial for the murder of Sidney Burnett. The agreement was talked about in a 1996 opinion from the Arkansas Supreme Court. So the agreement basically said that should Green be sentenced to death in Arkansas, Arkansas would hold him until the completion of that sentence. So until Green was executed. And like the Supreme Court said, Arkansas is only obliged to return Mr. Green to North Carolina if the prosecution in Arkansas is terminated in any manner other than the imposition of a judgment and death sentence. In 2016, Jack Green started corresponding with North Carolina requesting himself to be retried for the murder because that is still a pending charge. So in 2016, Jack started corresponding with Wilkes, North Carolina, where that charge is still pending, requesting to be retried for murder and kidnapping. It seems kind of like a strange move, except for that he was actually sentenced for execution in 2017. So maybe he thought that that was a way to put that off. I don't know. On May 2nd of the year 2000, Arkansas executed the first female that it had executed in over 150 years. That woman that was executed was named Christina Marie Riggs. Christina spent a short amount of time on death row. Her crime occurred in 97, so she was only on death row for less than 3 years. In 1997, Christina was living in an apartment in Sherwood with her 2 children, Justin Thomas, who was 5 years old, and Shelby Riggs, who was 2 years old. She was estranged from her husband, John Riggs, at the time of the crime. Christina was working as an LPN. I believe that she was working at Arkansas Heart Hospital at the time of her crime. Christina had struggled with depression for a major part of her life, so she decided that she was going to do a murder-suicide with her 2 children. Because of her work as a LPN, Christina could get medications that most of us couldn't. Christina stole potassium chloride from her work, and she also stole morphine. She was able to get Elavil, a medication, from her pharmacist. Elavil has a sedative property, and that's what she was going to use it for. So on November 4th, 1997, Christina mixed Elavil and water and gave it to her 2 children to drink. When they were passed out, she injected Justin in the neck with undiluted potassium chloride. Potassium chloride burns if it's undiluted, so it burned a great deal and caused him excruciating pain. So she injected him with morphine. She rocked him while the morphine was taking effect, and then she smothered him to death. She didn't try to inject Shelby because of what had happened with Justin, so she just smothered Shelby. She took her 2 children that were deceased and put them in her bed and covered them up. She then took 28 Elavil tablets herself and injected herself with potassium chloride. Christina wrote 2 suicide notes. One of them said, "I hope one day you will forgive me for taking my life and the life of my children, but I can't live like this anymore, and I couldn't bear to leave my children behind, to be a burden on you, or to be separated and raised apart from their fathers, and live knowing their mother killed herself." The next day, when she didn't show up at work and didn't answer the phone, her mother came to check on her. That was November the 5th. Part 2. This is part 2 on Christina Riggs. I'm really sorry I tried to fit it into a part 1, but I couldn't. There's just too much. So Christina left 2 suicide notes. Just my personal thoughts on the suicide notes. How dare you? I hate when parents do this. I couldn't bear the thought of my children thinking that I did something so terrible, so I murdered them instead. What are you thinking? Anyway, that's just my opinion. So on November 5th, her mother came to check on her. She found them all and thought that they were all deceased. She called the police, and ambulance came and took Christina to the hospital. I said Christina had injected herself with potassium chloride. That potassium chloride had burned through a silver dollar-size hole in her arm. So Christina went to trial in 1998. She tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. She blamed her chronic depression, but she was convicted by a jury. In the penalty phase of the trial, she wouldn't allow her attorneys to defend her. She said that she wanted a death sentence. When Christina was taken to death row at McPherson Prison in Newport, she was the only woman there, of course, since there aren't any other women on death row in Arkansas. Christina was executed May 2nd of 2000. Her final words were, "There is no way, no words can express how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. Now I can be with my babies as I always intended. I love you, my babies."